Pay attention to this security camera footage. March 22nd, 2026, 3:14 in the morning. A quiet living room in Oak Creek, Michigan. The camera, an infrared model mounted high above the back door, captures a scene that seems like the very definition of devotion. You see a man, Julian, dressed in a dark robe, moving softly across the hardwood floor. He approaches the sofa where his wife, Clara, is lying under a thick wool blanket. She looks peaceful, her eyes closed, her breathing to the untrained eye invisible. Julian leans down. He adjusts the blanket, tucking it gently around her shoulders. Then, he pauses. He leans closer and places a soft, lingering kiss on her forehead. For a few seconds, he stays there, his face pressed against her skin. It looks like a final, tender goodnight to a woman battling the final stages of a terminal illness. To the 20,000 residents of this town, this 14-second clip was proof of a love that stayed strong until the very end. But look at the right side of the screen. This is the crime scene photograph taken exactly 5 hours later at 8:15 in the morning. Clara is in the same position. The same blanket is draped over her. Her face is still serene, but the light is different. The morning sun reveals a stillness that is no longer peaceful. It is absolute. Most people who watched this footage in the days following her death saw a moment of profound grief. They saw a husband who had spent 2 years sacrificing his career to be his wife's primary caregiver. But investigators saw something else. They didn't look at the kiss as a gesture of affection. They looked at the specific angle of Julian's head and the way his hand lingered on the side of Clara's neck. They consulted forensic experts who analyzed the biometrics of that moment. And what they found was a chilling truth. At the exact moment that kiss was placed on her forehead, Clara had already been dead for over 2 hours. Julian was not saying goodbye. He was not praying for a miracle. He was performing a thermal check. He was feeling for the last remnants of body heat, calculating exactly how much time he had left before the cooling of the skin would betray the timeline he had carefully constructed. He was a professional architect, a man who understood structures, foundations, and mass, and he was currently laying the foundation for the most perfect murder Oak Creek had ever seen. In the next 40 minutes, you are going to see how a moment that looked like pure love became the primary evidence in a homicide conspiracy. You will see how a woman who spent her life saving children from terminal diseases became the victim of a man who saw her only as a financial liability. This is not just a story about a bad marriage or a greedy husband. This is about the predatory window, that specific moment when a person with deeply suppressed antisocial tendencies encounters a situation that appears to offer consequence-free control over another human being. It is a study in how predators operate inside relationships, using the accumulated trust of a marriage as their most effective security system. For 12 years, Julian and Clara were the golden couple of Oak Creek. She was the pediatrician who delivered care to 3 generations of families and remembered every child's birthday. He was the visionary architect who designed the local library and the town's most beautiful home. When Clara was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, the town watched as Julian stepped away from his firm to become her full-time nurse. He cooked every meal. He managed every pill. He sat with her through every painful night. The community trusted him because he had spent a decade building a reputation that was bulletproof. No one questioned why Clara was declining so rapidly. No one questioned the detox juices Julian insisted on making for her every morning. They saw only the sacrifice. They saw only the kiss. What they didn't see was the $5 million life insurance policy sitting in a safe upstairs. They didn't see the catastrophic debt piling up in a hidden cryptocurrency account that was minutes away from being flagged by federal investigators. And they didn't see the secret. Clara was keeping a secret that meant she wasn't just his patient. She was his judge, his jury, and eventually, his executioner. This is the reality collapse of a marriage that looked functional from any reasonable distance, but was actually a prison built out of the very bones of their house. It is a story of how a motion-activated camera, installed for the simplest reasons, recorded the footage that ended a secret that had lasted for years. And it all began with a kiss at 3:14 in the morning. Clara Ravenwood was 38 years old when she received the diagnosis that changed everything, but by then, she had already lived a lifetime of service. As a dedicated pediatrician in the town of Oak Creek, she had spent her career in the trenches of pediatric oncology, fighting to save children from the very same disease that would eventually claim her own life. To the parents in town, she was a guardian angel, the kind of doctor who would stay by a bedside until 3 in the morning just to see a fever break. Even as her own health began to fail, Clara's focus remained outward. She used every dollar of her personal savings to establish a permanent scholarship fund for underprivileged children suffering from chronic illnesses, ensuring her legacy would be measured in lives saved rather than assets accumulated. She was the heart of the community, a symbol of sacrifice and kindness that everyone in Oak Creek felt lucky to know. Julian, on the other hand, was the man who built the world Clara inhabited. At 40 years old, he was a celebrated architect, known for a precise, modern aesthetic that favored clean lines and open spaces. He was a man of high visibility, frequently seen at black-tie charity galas, standing tall in a perfectly tailored tuxedo as the supportive husband to a local hero. When Clara's cancer progressed to stage 4, Julian made a move that cemented his status as the perfect husband in the eyes of the 20,000 residents of Oak Creek. He announced he was stepping down from his firm entirely to become her primary caregiver. For 2 years, he was a ghost in the professional world, dedicating every hour of his day to managing her treatment, her nutrition, and her comfort. To the public, he was a saint, a man whose devotion was as structurally sound as the buildings he designed. In a town like Oak Creek, where everyone knows everyone and privacy is a rare commodity, Julian and Clara's house on the east side became a symbol of stoic endurance. It was a property that had been in Julian's family for 3 generations, a sturdy structure with thick walls and deep foundations designed to outlast the people who lived inside them. To the neighbors, their life looked completely functional, a well-oiled machine of medical appointments and quiet evenings. Julian was meticulously organized, handling the complex logistics of chemotherapy and radiation with the same precision he once applied to blueprints. He was famous for his detox juices, vibrant blends of organic fruits and vegetables he insisted were essential for cleansing Clara's system of the harsh chemicals used in her treatment. However, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, there were details that the community missed, the kind of structural sound that does not obey the normal rules of noise. There was a coldness that had settled into the marriage years ago, a distance that was not a problem to be solved but a fundamental part of the architecture of their relationship. Like the predators investigators have studied in other cases of domestic deception, Julian had built a life that was a sustained performance of a person he was not. While the town saw a devoted caregiver, the reality was a man who had isolated his wife under the guise of protection. He kept Clara away from the hospital where she had worked and away from the friends who wanted to check on her, claiming she was too weak for visitors and needed total quiet to heal. Predators like Julian do not always operate through force. They use the accumulated trust of a marriage as a security system, working from the inside out, to ensure their victim never suspects the danger until it is too late. For 2 years, Julian maintained the facade of the devoted husband who had sacrificed everything for love. But behind the closed doors of their historic home, the clean lines of Julian's life were starting to fray. The architecture of his world was built on a lie, and as Clara's body weakened, his grip on his own secrets began to tighten. He was not just waiting for the end of her life. He was preparing for the beginning of his own freedom, a freedom he believed he had earned through his performance of devotion. The residents of Oak Creek would often see Julian at the local market, his cart filled with the specific ingredients for Clara's dietary regimen. He would stop and talk to her former patients, his voice lowering with just the right amount of practiced sorrow as he described her courageous battle. He was a man who understood the value of optics. He knew that if he looked the part of the grieving, exhausted husband, no one would ever look too closely at the contents of the glasses he was handing to his wife. Clara, even in her physical decline, remained sharp, a byproduct of a life spent diagnosing the subtle shifts in a child's health. She was a woman who understood biology and the way chemicals interact with the human body. As she lay on that sofa, watching the man she had loved for over a decade move through their house, she began to notice a pattern in the rhythm of her own deterioration. It was not just the cancer, there was a specific metallic taste that followed her morning juice, a slight tremor in her hands that did not match her oncology reports. She began to realize that the man she shared her life with was a stranger, and that the detox he was providing was actually the mechanism of her destruction. This was the dynamic of the Ravenwood house in the months leading up to that final March night. An angel of the community, trapped in a house of mirrors and an architect of deception, waiting for the structural collapse that would solve his every problem. Julian did not simply want freedom from a sick wife. He was drowning in a financial abyss that no one in Oak Creek could have imagined. Beneath the polished granite countertops and the architect-designed aesthetic of their home, a black hole of debt was expanding, threatening to swallow the facade he had spent 12 years constructing. Julian had ventured deep into the world of illegal cryptocurrency investments, pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into offshore accounts and unregulated exchanges in a desperate bid to amplify his wealth. By the end of 2025, the market had turned, and Julian's portfolio had not just dipped, it had completely evaporated. He was facing debts that exceeded $3 million, and more importantly, he was aware that federal investigators were starting to look into the laundering patterns of the very exchanges he had used. He needed a massive influx of capital, and he needed it before the authorities arrived at his doorstep. The solution was sitting right in front of him, resting on the sofa every evening. Clara's life insurance policy was worth $5 million, a staggering amount that would not only clear his debts, but leave him with a significant cushion to rebuild his life in whatever way he chose. But a sudden death would be suspicious, especially for a woman under constant, albeit controlled, medical supervision. An architect like Julian understood that a structure only holds if the foundations are solid. He could not just kill her. He had to let her fade away in a manner that mirrored the natural progression of her stage 4 cancer. He utilized his background in chemistry to craft a plan that was as elegant and cold as any skyscraper he had ever designed. He began a surgical process of slow-motion homicide that lasted exactly 6 months. Every morning, Julian would prepare a vibrant, healthy-looking detox juice for Clara, ostensibly to help her body manage the toxins from her chemotherapy and radiation treatments. To any neighbor looking through the kitchen window, it was a beautiful display of care, a husband juicing fresh wheatgrass, beets, and organic ginger to sustain his fading wife. But hidden within those mixtures was a carefully calibrated cocktail of toxins, colorless, odorless, and virtually undetectable in a standard blood panel. He used a combination of heavy metals and synthetic compounds that mimicked the symptoms of advanced systemic failure and secondary infections. To the world, and even to her own oncology team, Clara's rapid decline looked like a natural consequence of her disease reaching its inevitable conclusion. He watched her with the clinical, detached eye of an engineer monitoring a structural stress test. He noted the way her hands began to develop a fine tremor, the way her cognitive clarity would flicker and dim, and the way her once vibrant spirit was being crushed by a fatigue that no amount of sleep could touch. He was playing a dangerous game with the timeline, pushing her body to the brink but keeping her alive just long enough to ensure that when the end finally came, it would be accepted as a tragedy, not a crime. He was so confident in his mastery of the situation that he began to feel a sense of righteous entitlement. He believed that because he was performing the role of the devoted husband so perfectly, sacrificing his social life and his career for her care, he had earned the $5 million that was coming his way. He did not see a human being. He saw a financial transaction that was nearing completion. Julian was a man who understood that if you tell a lie long enough and surround it with the right architecture, people will move into it and call it the truth. He had spent years building a reputation that served as his primary defense, a pillar of the community who was universally loved and respected. He believed that because everyone wanted to believe he was a saint, no one would ever dare to look into the glass he handed her every morning. He even went so far as to document her decline in a public blog, garnering thousands of comments of support from the townspeople, which he planned to use as evidence of her natural passing. But what Julian failed to account for was the very quality that had made Clara a legendary pediatrician, her diagnostic instinct. Even as the toxins clouded her mind, Clara began to recognize the metallic tang in her mouth and the specific rhythm of her symptoms. She realized that the man she shared her life with was a stranger, and that the house she thought was her sanctuary had become a meticulously designed trap. While Julian was waiting for the $5 million to hit his account, he was oblivious to the fact that his victim had already started building a Trojan horse of her own. He thought he was the only one with a secret, but Clara was about to show him that even a weakened heart can have a very long memory. What Julian did not understand was that while he was architecting a murder, his wife was performing a life-saving diagnosis on herself. Clara Ravenwood was a woman who had spent her entire career reading the subtle, non-verbal cues of sick children who could not tell her where it hurt. She noticed the way Julian's eyes never quite met hers when he handed her the morning juice. She noticed the fine tremor in her hands that did not align with her cancer's progression. As a physician, she knew that cancer is a slow erosion, not a series of rhythmic, metallic-tasting crashes. She realized that her husband was not her caregiver, but her captor, utilizing the accumulated trust of their 12-year marriage to mask a crime. This is what psychologists call a reality collapse. It is not just the discovery of a betrayal, it is the complete restructuring of every memory and every closed door within a home. Clara knew that if she confronted Julian, she would likely die faster, and the $5 million would be his without a struggle. Instead, she chose to become a Trojan horse. She continued to drink the juice, but every night, while Julian believed she was sleeping, she used her tablet to record secret video diaries. She sent these files to a secure, password-protected cloud account that she shared with her attorney, documenting every symptom, every metallic taste, and every suspicious behavior Julian exhibited. In her final recording, her voice was a raspy whisper, but her mind was as sharp as a scalpel. She said, "Julian, I know what you are doing. I will give you what you want, my death, but it will be the evidence that puts you in a cage forever." Julian's plan was nearly perfect, but he made a fatal mistake by underestimating the very technology he tried to manipulate. He knew Clara wore a health ring, a small, sophisticated device that tracked her heart rate, body temperature, and sleep cycles. After she passed away at approximately 1 a.m. on March 22nd, Julian moved her body to the sofa to stage the scene for the morning light. To ensure her death appeared to happen later, he threw the ring from her cold finger and wore it on his own hand, walking around the house at 4 a.m. to create a fake trail of biometric data showing that she was still alive and moving. He believed he was being brilliant, but he was a man trapped in a predatory window, blinded by his own sense of superiority. The health ring's advanced biometric sensors did more than just count heartbeats. They recorded skin temperature, respiratory frequency, and movement patterns that are unique to each individual. When forensic investigators later pulled the data from the cloud, they saw a sudden and impossible shift at 1:30 in the morning. The skin temperature rose by 4 degrees, the difference between a woman in the final stages of systemic failure and a healthy, middle-aged man. The respiratory rate nearly doubled, capturing the shallow, panicked breathing of a killer trying to outrun the clock. Julian had tried to wear her life like a costume, but the ring recorded the biometrics of his own guilt instead. The reckoning arrived on April 15th, 2026. Julian stood in the mahogany-paneled office of Clara's estate attorney, his face a practiced mask of somber dignity. He was there to sign the final documents that would release the $5 million life insurance payout and transfer the deed of their historic home into his sole name. He believed he had won. He believed that the architecture of his lie was finally airtight, the foundations settled, and the structure secure. But as he reached for the fountain pen to finalize the claim, the door did not open for a legal clerk. It opened for 4 detectives from the Oak Creek Police Department. They did not just arrive with handcuffs. They brought the digital ghost of Clara Ravenwood. They presented the evidence that Julian never thought existed. The health ring data that captured his panicked biometrics at 4 a.m, and the 14 video diaries Clara had uploaded to a secure, password-protected cloud server. The final video was played in the Saginaw County courtroom 6 months later. In it, Clara, her face pale but her eyes burning with a physician's clarity, detailed the metallic taste of the detox juice and her discovery of the financial records Julian thought he had deleted. The jury watched as the perfect husband was stripped of his facade, revealed as a predator who had calculated his wife's death to fill a hole in his cryptocurrency portfolio. Under the state's Slayer statute, the legal irony was absolute. The statute dictates that no person who feloniously and intentionally kills another shall in any way acquire any property or receive any benefit as a result of the death of the decedent. Because Julian was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy, his rights to the $5 million and the family home were instantly voided. Furthermore, the judge applied the Cy Pres doctrine, a legal principle used to redirect funds when the original intent of a bequest cannot be carried out due to unforeseen circumstances. Since Clara's primary wish was to support medical research and the protection of the vulnerable, the entire $5 million estate was donated to establish the Clara Ravenwood Memorial Fund for forensic toxicology research. The money Julian had murdered for was now being used to train the next generation of specialists to detect the very toxins he had used. The irony is a closed circle. The architect of a murder funded the very architecture of his own downfall. In October 2026, Julian was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no emotion, no apology, and no remorse, maintaining the same chilling stillness he had shown on the security camera at 3:14 in the morning when he kissed a woman who had already been dead for 2 hours. The final image of this case is not of the beautiful home on the east side, which was eventually demolished to make way for a community park dedicated to pediatric health. Instead, it is a grainy piece of security footage from the very hospital where Clara once saved lives. In the video, a man in an orange prison jumpsuit is seen mopping the floors of the pediatric oncology wing. It is Julian. As part of a supervised restitution work program, he is forced to clean the hallways where his wife was once a hero, working under the silent, judging gaze of the doctors and nurses who once called him a saint. He is no longer the celebrated architect. He is a man who destroyed his entire life for money he will never see, living out his days in the shadow of the woman he could not break.